Welcome to one more lecture of this self-knowledge course. In the previous conference we learned about some laws of force, and how we can take advantage of the current of sound, or current of life, to raise our inner work to higher octaves. And we learned how to counteract that law of entropy that constantly leads us to lose strength in anything we undertake. In today's conference we will see how, after embarking strongly on this path, that leads us to achieve that great purpose of our existence, which is the self-realization of the being, to create a permanent center of gravity in our consciousness. So that this allows us to have continuity of purposes and perseverance in our inner work. So, the objective of this conference will be to understand the importance of dedicating the entirety of our existence to inner work, and how to achieve a continuity of purposes that ensures success in this feat. And to get into the context of this topic, let's first look at what a center of gravity is. What is a center of gravity? We know that the law of gravity applies in the universe. We see that the planets revolve around the sun, and we see that the moons revolve around the planets. These stars are attracted by a gravitational force that keeps them permanently rotating in that orbit. It is thanks to this that the universe maintains an order, an organization. Otherwise, everything would be scattered and without any order. The center of gravity is that point where all forces or energies converge. We, in our psychology, also have a center of gravity. The interesting thing is to discover where we have placed that gravitational point. If our desires, wills, and desires revolve around personality, or around consciousness. In the state we are in, we tend to always gravitate around things of personality. But if we want to start moving forward in our spiritual work, we must start to revolve around consciousness. We must learn to change this center of gravity so that we can achieve everything we set out to do in relation to our spiritual work. If all the forces or energies are focused on the same point, the achievement of that objective will gain strength. And if one is seriously thinking of achieving self-realization, of transforming from a human personality to a solar man, and from a solar man to a superman, and from a superman to an absolute man, there needs to be continuity of purpose. Every human being has a center of gravity, and that center of gravity will be in what we dedicate ourselves to, with continuity of purpose. We will see that, if we have continuity of purpose based on an objective, it is certain that we can achieve it, but if we are dispersed, we will not obtain results. And this not only happens in inner work, but also in any aspect of life itself. For example, a person who has practiced the piano since he was a child, dedicating a good number of hours in his daily practice, and with a continuity of purpose towards the goal of becoming the best pianist of his time. When he grows up, he achieves this goal. And why was this possible? Because he had a continuity of purpose, unlike anyone else who has not had that discipline and that continuity of purpose. Of course, we are going to go for higher objectives than any passing achievement that the personality can achieve, since we are going for the intimate self-realization of our being. And if it is really our objective to achieve liberation, to reach enlightenment, and to awaken 100% of our consciousness, our time and our energies must be focused on that objective, which is to become solar men. Since a multiplicity of eyes exist within us, the permanent center of gravity cannot exist. It is just normal that not all people become intimately self-realized. We know well that the intimate self-realization of the being requires continuity of purposes, and since it is very difficult to find someone who has a permanent center of gravity, then it is not strange that it is very rare the person who reaches self-realization. But it happens that, just as we saw at the Radical Change Conference, we are not one, but we are many. And for this reason, it is very difficult for us to have continuity of purpose towards any objective. We want to self-realize, but there is no responsible individual within us who can achieve that goal. Who would be that responsible individual? Well, it would be our consciousness. But our consciousness almost never expresses itself in us because we do not let it express itself, since we have a multiplicity of psychological defects, which are what control our physical body. And each of these individuals thinks differently, desires different things, and has their own interests and concepts. And this prevents us from having a continuity of purpose that allows us to truly achieve any goal we set for ourselves. We can confirm this by remembering any moment in which we have undertaken something with great enthusiasm, but a short time later we have lost interest in it. And another I, very different from the one who with so much enthusiasm wanted to achieve it, now manifests itself in us with other interests, and with a total discouragement towards what we had undertaken. We see it even when we have very excitedly chosen and bought something, and a few days later we begin to see defects in it and find that another model is prettier or better. And this is because what an I affirms at a given moment cannot have any seriousness, because then another I manifests itself who has the opposite opinion. As long as there is not a responsible individual within us who takes the lead, who positively guides our physical body, in this case the consciousness, it will be difficult to have continuity of purposes. Many people live inside us, and each one has their own way of thinking, and their own way of doing things. 97% of our essence is trapped in our multiplicity of negative ways of being. What we want today, we hate tomorrow. What we are passionate about today, we dislike tomorrow. What interests us today, tomorrow loses total interest for us. And this is the reason why it is so difficult for us to achieve objectives, to achieve goals. And therefore, it is the same thing that will not allow us to achieve that final objective, or that great purpose that our existence has, which is to achieve total liberation and the awakening of 100% of our consciousness. As long as we do not learn to have a continuity of purposes in psychological death, so that our consciousness can constantly manifest, we will not be that responsible individual who seriously carries out his inner work to a successful conclusion. Due to this multiplicity of I's that exist within us, the full sense of responsibility doesn't really exist in us. Many people receive this knowledge and have a sincere desire for self-realization, and they even have a lot of strength. However, very few maintain themselves and reach the final goal. And this is because, as long as we don't have a permanent center of gravity around that objective, and a continuity of purposes in the aspects that will take us to that objective, we will not achieve it. The I that today wants to self-realize, tomorrow is replaced by another, who is more interested in the things of life and personality. And the thing is that this work is totally practical, and we have to do it ourselves. No one can do this work for us. No one can save us from ourselves. The greatest help we will receive are messengers, who come to show us the way and demonstrate, with their lives, that liberation and enlightenment are possible. But the work itself has to be done by each of us individually. Therefore, if we want to advance in this work, we have to create a permanent center of gravity around it. Many people come to these studies strong and with a lot of spirit, but after a while they lose that spirit and don't want to know anything about this knowledge, or about the inner work, about psychological death, or about sexual transmutation. Then they permanently abandon these studies and let themselves be swallowed up by life. Obviously, if we don't fight against life, it devours us, and rare are the aspirants who truly don't allow themselves to be swallowed by life. It is also the case that many withdraw from inner work for any reason, fair or unfair, complicated or simple. And then they usually join any pseudo-esoteric school, where they will be asked to become believers, making them believe that by attending those meetings or services, and giving a financial contribution, they will achieve internal progress. Or that by reaching leadership positions in those institutions, they are already advancing internally. And thus, they stagnate in their inner progress, and they deceive themselves. And this happens because the person didn't know how to maintain a continuity of purpose in their interior work, and they prefer to look for where they are offered with an easy salvation. All this coming and going, all this incessant changing of schools, sects, religions, is due to the multiplicity of I's that within us fight among themselves for their own supremacy. The subject itself is nothing more than a machine that sometimes serves as a vehicle for one eye or another. And some mystical eyes deceive themselves, after abandoning this, or that sect, decide to believe themselves to be gods, they shine like will-o'-the-wisps and finally disappear. Actually, the most normal thing is for people to get excited at the prospect of being able to awaken their consciousness, and after a while, they abandon that goal. The strange thing, what very rarely happens, is that someone doesn't abandon work on himself and manages to become a solar man. And the creation of solar man is not possible at all, if we don't first establish a permanent center of gravity within ourselves. But what is a solar man? Let's look at this. A solar man is one who manages to develop within himself those solar germs that will allow him to create himself internally and to serve the interests of the solar experiment. What is the solar experiment? It is that creation that makes God, or sacred absolute Son, which as we saw in Conference 28, is composed of a set of Christs that make up what is called the universal Christ. So, the solar experiment is that creation that the Sun makes with the objective that the divine sparks can develop as solar men, or men who awaken 100% consciousness, who develop their individual Christ, or their inner fire, and become an active part of that universal Christ. The reason why the universe, the galaxies, the planets, and the human beings of this, and other planets, were created, is so that the sparks that emanate from the absolute Sun in search of wisdom through experience have the possibility to become solar men. Although official science doesn't know it, or doesn't admit it, the vast majority of planets in the solar system have intelligent life. And that life exists with the same purpose, which is to produce men who work on themselves, who awaken all their consciousness. That is the purpose of all creation. And for this, within each human being, there are solar germs that allow this objective to be met. What are those solar germs? They are the sexual creative energy found in our sexual gonads, in the testicles in men, and in women in the ovaries. Using the transmutation of that energy in a correct and positive way, we can create ourselves. That is, we are all a potential solar man. However, it happens that not all solar germs germinate or develop. Not all seeds come to fruition, and the vast majority are lost. And why is this? As we see in the famous parable of the sower by Master Jesus, some seeds fall on the road and are eaten by birds, others fall on stones, germinate, but cannot take root and dry out. Others fall among herbs or thorns and are covered and destroyed by them. While others, on the other hand, fall on fertile soil, and those are the ones that germinate, grow, and develop. This is what happens with us. We have that solar seed or germs within us, but we must have favorable circumstances so that they can develop. So, what are the requirements for those solar germs inside us to germinate? Firstly, we need to have 3 aspects of our body in good condition. The mind must be in good condition, because with it we are going to reflect, to consciously imagine, to use free will to be able to deny our desires. So, if a person has problems of the mind, to a point where he cannot even reflect on his mistakes, then he wouldn't be able to do his inner work in that existence. The spinal column must also be in good condition, since it is through our spinal cord that the sexual creative energy will rise, creating our existential bodies of being through the practice of supra-sex. The spine cannot be broken. It could have a hernia or a deviation, that is not a problem, but if the spine is broken, the person would be disabled and would not be able to raise his energy. The sexual apparatus must also be functional to be able to develop solar germs. If a person had a tubal ligation or cut, or a vasectomy, they are processes that can be reversed through a recanalization operation, and the person would have the opportunity to do their work for self-realization in this existence. But if the person lost important parts of the reproductive system, and the process is no longer reversible, they could not do the work of sexual transmutation to create existential bodies. He or she could only work on psychological death and sacrifice for humanity, seeking to transcend that karma, and negotiate with divine law so that in the next existence he or she could have the opportunity and conditions to do the work of self-realization. In addition to the requirement of having these three aspects of the physical body in a normal state, the person must have the objective knowledge of the three factors of the revolution of consciousness, focused on practice. The person must know how to eliminate their psychological defects through death on march and reflective meditation. You must also know how to create your existential bodies of being through the practice of suprasex or sexual transmutation. Knowing the step-by-step of that practice, the requirements that are fidelity, chastity, and love. And he must also know how to generate dharma to pay off his karmic debts by working for humanity, and thus developing conscious love. Having a physical body in good condition, and having this knowledge already clear, the third requirement will be to achieve continuity of purpose in each of the practices that will allow you to achieve success in that wonderful purpose that our existence has. And this is true throughout the universe. Any race created by the Sun has no other objective in nature than to serve the interests of this creation and the solar experiment. All the sparks that come out of the Absolute come with that purpose, and of each of the races that have existed on the planet, the Sun has achieved some triumphs, harvesting small groups of solar men. These have been the men who throughout the history of the planet have managed to awaken their consciousnesses. But it happens that unfortunately most people, currently, are not interested in this work. And there are very few that meet those requirements we are talking about. And it happens that, if the Sun fails in its experiment, it loses all interest in such a race, and it is in fact condemned to destruction and involution. Because when a race has already borne its fruits, it progressively disappears or perishes violently through great catastrophes. And this with the purpose that there is a process of revitalization of the planet, to give way to the formation of a new race, that begins its entire development process, beginning with the golden age of that race. A practical example that we could see to understand this is that if we sow seeds in the ground, but those seeds don't germinate or bear fruit, what would we do? Well, we would eliminate that damaged crop and recondition the land again to plant another new crop. That will happen on this earth with this race. If this Aryan race, which is the fifth that this planet has produced, no longer bears fruit, and all people definitely want to degenerate, then it is condemned to destruction. This planet is experiencing that moment. This race has already been condemned to destruction, because there are almost no people really interested in regenerating themselves. Humanity is already very degenerated, and the worst thing is that it proudly defends and celebrates degeneration. We are already experiencing the final times of this race, as it will little by little be eliminated through catastrophes and wars. However, those who still want to work on themselves, and manage to at least regenerate their physical body and their vital body, will be able to be part of an exodus to become the first settlers of the next race. It is because we are at this critical moment that knowledge has been open to all of humanity and is being taught openly, to find and give the opportunity to those who still long for regeneration and liberation. So, it is necessary to keep in mind that, only by working on ourselves with true continuity of purpose, and a complete sense of moral responsibility, can we become solar men. And this will imply that we consecrate the entirety of our existence to esoteric work on ourselves. Therefore, in order for us to achieve a center of gravity around our consciousness that leads us to self-realization, the first thing we need to do is make a very important decision. We must investigate ourselves, and honestly ask ourselves if we are really willing to dedicate our entire existence to achieving that purpose. This may be the most important decision we make in our lives. Search through psychological death, and inner silence, that it is our conscience that drives that decision, not a simple passion of the moment moved by some self. And if we really have that firm decision, we have to know that in order to have a center of gravity around this decision, we need to dedicate our time to achieving this purpose. And we must work to constantly eliminate all the psychological defects that manifest themselves seeking to make us deviate from that clear north that we have proposed. The center of gravity is summarized in one word: time. And our center of gravity will always be around what we dedicate the most time to. Usually, people have their center of gravity around their profession. The doctor in his consultations and in his prescriptions, the housewife in the things in her home and in her children, the musician in his rehearsals and in his concerts, the architect in his plans and in his works, etc. But all these things belong to the personality. They can lead us to reap material or personal fruits for this existence. However, they will not lead us to achieve anything that can transcend, nothing that really transcends time, or leads us to achieve the purpose of our existence. And it turns out that our 3% is not at all interested in the subjective things of personality. What really interests our being is being born, that is, creating the existential bodies. Dying, which is releasing and awakening consciousness. And helping others to know the path of self-realization. That is the office or work of our being. And it is our own being who knows how to retrace the entire path that will take us back to the stars. Therefore, we must focus with continuity of purposes on the work of our being. But if we analyze what we spend our time on throughout the day, we will see that we dedicate time to family, material work, social commitments, leisure, social networks, movies, series, and different things about personality. And we can realize how little time we are dedicating to the things of consciousness. So, we must encourage ourselves to begin making a gradual change. To start taking time away from the personality and dedicating it to practices for awakening consciousness. We must generate a discipline in meditation on the different lustful defects that lead us to fornication and prevent us from achieving chastity. As well as a discipline in working with all those defects that are manifesting themselves daily, preventing the manifestation of our consciousness. We must generate a discipline around the practices of spiritual birth and of sacrifice for humanity. We must make an effort to develop concentration and relaxation, to achieve astral projection, to communicate directly with our being and consciously investigating in the higher dimensions of nature. Every practice requires patience, discipline, and continuity of purpose. This change must be gradual, because when you make changes fanatically you will not get real results. So, the ideal is to gradually take time away from the personality. For example, if we sleep 9 hours, then we take away 2 hours from sleep and put 1 hour into suprasex, and 1 hour into meditation, and we maintain that over time. We do it with determination and with continuity of purpose. We take away some hours that we previously dedicated to leisure, and we begin to dedicate them to doing the practice of watching and praying, which we learned in Conference 21, doing the practices of transferring funds and negotiating with the law, that we learned in Conference 13. And we sustain that over time. And so, gradually, we take time away from the personality things, and we put some time into making some sacrifice for humanity, talking to others about the things we have learned and experienced with this knowledge, etc. And above all, keep ourselves in constant self-observation and psychological death to eliminate from moment to moment all those eyes that want to manifest in us. Because they only lead us to lose strength and interest in our own spiritual progress, and they make us return to the things of life and personality. We must know that in inner work we cannot give ourselves have the luxury of versatility. Those who have weather-vane ideas, those who today work on their psyche and tomorrow allow themselves to be swallowed by life, those who look for evasion, justifications to abandon esoteric work, will degenerate and devolve. Some postpone the era, leave everything for tomorrow while they improve their economic situation, without taking into account that the solar experiment is something very different from their personal criteria and their well-known projects. Our ego is lunar, and it is not so easy to become a solar man when we carry the moon inside us. In lecture number 9, when we talked about the infra-dimensions that live in our lower abdomen, we talked about how we have 2 moons inside us, the visible moon and the invisible moon. We were talking about how the visible moon represents the fascination we have with things of personality, and all those defects that we have inside us, and that many times even pass as good. And that we easily see, but that we usually justify, because we see them as something normal. And the invisible moon is the dark part of our psychology, and represents the heaviest defects that we have, and that only come out at certain times and under certain circumstances. Well, likewise, the earth has two moons. The first is the moon that we see every night, which internally is known as Nehema. The second of these is called Lilith, and is a little more distant than the white moon. Astronomers usually see Lilith as a lentil, since it is very small in size. That is the black moon. Lilith, in its orbit, approaches the Earth in certain parts of the year, and when it approaches, it activates the heaviest defects in people's psychology. The most sinister forces of the ego come to Earth from Lilith and produce subhuman and bestial psychological results. The crimes of the Red Press, the most monstrous murders in history, the most unsuspected crimes, etc., are due to the vibrational waves of Lilith. The double lunar influence, represented in the human being through the ego that carries within him, makes us a true failure. If we don't see the urgency of giving the entirety of our existence to work on ourselves, with the purpose of freeing ourselves from the double lunar force, we will end up swallowed by the moon, devolving, degenerating more and more within certain states that we could well classify as unconscious and infraconscious. The serious thing about all this is that we don't possess true individuality. If we had a permanent center of gravity, we would work really seriously until we achieve the solar state. But there are so many excuses in these questions, there are so many evasions, there are so many fascinating attractions, that in fact it often becomes almost impossible to understand the urgency of the esoteric work. We hope that we can come to that understanding, and that this conference has helped you gain clarity on how to achieve a permanent center of gravity around your own inner work. Without further ado, I invite you to the next conference, in which we will talk about an important and interesting topic: family and attachments. In this topic we will talk about the true value of the family, the existing types of family, and we will talk about the stagnation and conflicts that attachment generates. Thank you all and have a happy rest of the day.